we play probabilities, right? And then sometimes probabilities are high enough that they dictate action. Sometimes probabilities are low enough that they dictate patience, right? The anatomy of a conspiracy, exactly what you're talking about, right? Every conspiracy starts with a fact. Something happens. Then, immediately following that fact, we're faced with something that's not known, right? Whether it's what happened with FTX or whether it's what happened with this dude in the Bahamas. We're faced with something that's not known. Once you're faced with something that's not known, the natural human tendency, not among dumbasses, but among smart people, right? Conspiracy theorists are, for the most part, pretty smart people, right? The next natural reaction when you're facing unknown information is skepticism. Skepticism. You're asking yourself, why don't I know this? Why doesn't somebody know this? Shouldn't somebody know this? Right? Those are the first 3 steps in the birth of a conspiracy. And then it's human nature that when you become skeptical, then you start to write a story in your head that erases the skepticism. You connect the dots on your own with a piece missing in between.
There you go, the missing link.
And then it just starts to cycle.
That's perfect.
And
that's well explained.
And because you're coming up with a logical, sound explanation at the end, all the other smart people and all the dumbasses out there, they can connect your story very quickly. So that's how conspiracies, boom, take off like wildflower.
And the agency is a nice missing link for a lot of stories. Well, we can never really know about it, but those guys know exactly what happened. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But it provides that missing link. It provides that bridge for skepticism to rid yourself of that and write your story.
What about when something's so obviously backed by something unknown, right? There's people who could define and say, oh, I know this thing is this, and they really have no evidence for that. But you look at something like the Epstein story, we know there's a massive conspiracy there. Who's behind it is a whole nother question. But I feel like intelligence organizations, perhaps around the world, not focused on the CIA right now, who could have some sort of exposure to that in some way, have every reason to be able to say, oh no, this guy was just a scumbag doing his thing or whatever. You guys are all conspiracy theorists talking about this.
Right.
And then they don't report about it in the mainstream media because they're all tied to it, by the way, but still.
Right. And to be fair, before the whole Epstein thing came out, it was like something like we were just looking at, and everyone was going, you guys are fucking crazy, thinking that, this could be some sort of bigger scheme. And then it all comes out, he gets arrested, and then the fucking book comes, or not the book, we didn't get the book, but we get evidence that, Clinton went down there and all this stuff, and it's like, oh wow, this did happen. And now we're like, okay. But if this happens all the time, that's why I always make the joke. I love the joke. What's the difference between a conspiracy theory and the truth? 6 months.
That's insane.
Yeah, the thing to understand is that all covert influence, the United States covert influence, Russian covert influence, Guatemalan covert influence, all covert influence starts with a stigma. Nobody creates a new story out of nowhere. You know how hard it is to get people motivated behind a brand new narrative that's never been said before? It's almost impossible. So you start by targeting an existing issue. You start by targeting an existing stigma. And then you just add fire to that stigma. You want to change an election anywhere in South America? You basically just fund one side or the other because
listen
they're
to
both
the
expert people. Right?
True.
Take all laughing aside, look what happened in 2016, 2020. Look what happened in 2022, right? You saw all this funding come in for messages on one side or the other. Right? Funding for Facebook, funding for Instagram, all these ads, all these groups. You had FBI and NSA and CIA and the director of counterintelligence for the United States openly telling everybody, be warned, you will see Russian meddling, you will see Chinese meddling. You had the Russian head of propaganda formally announced 2 days before the election this year, we are Russian, we are taking part in meddling in election. They publicly announcing it. We're meddling in the election this year. We're doing it right now. Right? You pick a stigma and that's what you fund. That's exactly how covert influence works. Now, does that mean that there are programs in the United States funded by CIA intentionally misdirecting the American people? That goes against all the authorities, that goes against everything we were taught. Now, does that mean that the CIA is going to step in and tell CNBC or CNN when they're saying something that's wrong? No, they're not going to do that. Perfect example. If you remember back in like June or July, the death toll for Russian soldiers was something ridiculous, like 80,000
Yeah.
dead Russians, 4,500 dead Ukrainians, as reported by a Ukrainian general. That stuff goes out there, gets approved in the news, goes out. That's all part of a giant war, information war that's happening between NATO countries and Russian countries. That doesn't mean it's coming from the United States. It means that somebody somewhere is providing that information somehow. When the United States head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff finally comes out and comments on the death toll, he did it, what, 2 days ago?
Yeah.
What did he say? 100,000 dead on both sides. All that misinformation, 8 months of misinformation, corrected with one formal statement from the Joint Chief of Staff, right? That's it. 100,000 dead on both sides. That's a crazy number of people, but it sets a completely new point of view on that conflict. No longer are these Ukrainian soldiers hyper proficient and the Russians idiots. Instead, you see pretty much a war of attrition between two sides that, even with all that Western funding, all that Western intel, all that Western military might, it's still essentially a very close and intimate fight.
Many civilians.
Yeah, it's terrible, right? So that is how information warfare happens. That's how influence campaigns happen. So yes, stigma is everything.